My husband's attorney called my 3 miscarriages a documented pattern of emotional instability. He said it calmly. That was what made it dangerous. He did not call me hysterical. He did not say I was unfit. He stood in a Virginia family courtroom, adjusted the cuff of his jacket, and presented my grief as something any responsible father should fear. Lieutenant Colonel Morgan has served her country honorably, he said. But military discipline is not the same as emotional readiness to care for a medically fragile infant. My son, Samuel, was 4 months old. Peter had visited him 6 times since our separation. He had never spent a night beside Samuel's incubator. He could not name the medication our son had taken after leaving the hospital. But that morning, he wore a navy suit and the expression of a man who believed calmness could replace truth. His mother, Patricia, sat behind him with both hands folded over her handbag. She had cried the first time she saw Samuel. She had touched one of his tiny fingers through the opening in the incubator and whispered that he was the answer to every prayer she had ever said. 3 weeks later, she helped another woman move into my house. Peter's attorney placed several photographs on the evidence table, the nursery drawers I had labeled, the feeding schedule beside Samuel's bassinet, the medication chart inside a cabinet. They described those things as evidence of rigidity. I had made them because Samuel had been born 6 weeks early and came home with weight checks, feeding instructions, medication, and a monitor that alarmed whenever the sensor slipped. Peter's attorney called it compulsive behavior. My lawyer, Daniel Ruiz, wrote one sentence on the legal pad between us. Let them define preparation as instability. Then Peter testified. I filed for temporary custody because I was worried about my son before he was born. Daniel stopped writing. He removed a certified court document from the folder in front of him. That part is true, he said. Peter's attorney turned toward him. Daniel handed the document to the clerk. Mr. Morgan filed his petition 21 days before the emergency delivery. The judge checked the filing date. So the premature birth did not cause his concern, Daniel said. The surgery did not cause it. The postpartum recovery did not cause it. Peter shifted in his chair. Daniel did not introduce the financial records yet. He closed the folder and sat down. That surprised Peter. It surprised me too. We had spent months following money, dates, and lies. But Daniel understood something I did not. If we showed everything too soon, Peter would have time to explain it. So the most important document remained inside the folder. 4 months earlier, I had believed my husband was frightened about becoming a father. I had not understood that while I was fighting to bring our son home, Peter was already preparing to make me look like the one person Samuel needed protection from. Peter and I had been married for 11 years. He had not always been cold. That mattered, because the person he became would have been easier to leave if I had never known the man he had been before. After my first miscarriage, Peter brought my own blanket to the hospital because he remembered that the wool ones made my skin itch. After the second, he sat beside me on the kitchen floor until nearly 3 in the morning. He burned 2 pieces of toast and ate the darker one himself. After the third, I told him I could not keep trying. I said it from a hospital bed without looking at him. Peter pressed his forehead against the back of my hand. Then we stop. For 6 months we did. We painted the guest room. We planted tomatoes behind the townhouse. We took one weekend trip where neither of us said the words pregnancy, fertility, or hospital. Then my mother died. She had always believed paperwork could protect people from chaos. She labeled folders, updated beneficiaries, and left instructions for everything from her car to her dog. Her estate included a trust for any future grandchild. It held a little over $600,000, but the money was restricted. It could be used for education, medical care, child care, and expenses directly connected to the child's needs. Neither parent could withdraw money at will. Peter attended the meeting with the estate attorney. On the drive home, he said my mother had thought of everything. At the time, I heard admiration. Later, I understood that he had also been listening to the rules. 6 months after her death, I became pregnant again. I waited 11 days before telling Peter. I wanted one small period in which the possibility belonged only to me. When I finally showed him the test, he sat on the edge of our bed and covered his face with both hands. Then he began crying. He pulled me against him. We're not losing this one. It was not a promise either of us had the power to make, but I needed to hear it. For most of the pregnancy, Peter behaved like the husband I remembered. He learned my medication schedule. He placed crackers beside the bed before I woke. He attended the early appointments. When fear kept me awake, he rested one hand against my back and counted my breaths. Those moments were real. So were the choices he made later. That contradiction was the part I struggled with longest. The first warning was a payment for $7,400. It appeared in the account we used for fertility treatment and pregnancy expenses. The transaction was labeled WDC Patient Services. Peter handled most of the insurance paperwork by then. After the third miscarriage, I had stopped studying every medical bill. Each one felt connected to a memory I did not want to revisit. I sent him a screenshot. "What is WDC?" He replied 20 minutes later. "Outside billing company. Testing and specialist imaging." "I'll verify it." That evening, he told me the charge was correct. I believed him. A week later, I found a cream-colored scarf in the passenger footwell of his car. It was not mine. Peter said it belonged to Celeste Ward, a vice president at Ashford Land Group, where he worked as regional acquisitions director. She had a dead battery. I drove her to a meeting. Celeste had approved his promotion. He described her as brutal, brilliant, and connected to every investor who mattered. I asked whether something was happening between them. Peter did not become defensive. He looked hurt. "After everything we've survived together, you really think I would do that now?" I apologized. Peter wrapped his arms around me. "You're scared," he said. "I understand." That answer quieted me more effectively than anger would have. He had transformed my suspicion into another symptom of pregnancy anxiety. At 32 weeks, my blood pressure began rising. Patricia started visiting more often. She brought casseroles, folded baby clothes, and made comments that sounded harmless, until I repeated them later. Babies don't follow military schedules. Peter worries there won't be room for him when the baby arrives. You understand that asking for help is not failure. One afternoon, I noticed her writing in a small notebook while I checked my blood pressure. "What are you writing?" She closed it. "A grocery list." My name was written at the top of the page. I should have asked to see it. Instead, I told myself she was worried. That explanation lasted until the morning everything changed. At 33 weeks and 5 days, I woke before dawn, with pain beneath my ribs. Peter was downstairs in the office, fully dressed, closing his laptop. "My blood pressure feels wrong." He checked the time on his phone, before walking toward me. That small movement stayed in my memory. The time first, then me. He drove me to the military hospital. The doctors attached monitors and began running tests. Peter stayed through the first examination. He brought warm milk from the cafeteria and rubbed circles against my wrist. When the fetal heart rate dipped, Peter stood so quickly that his chair struck the wall. "What does that mean?" The nurse told him they were watching it. He bent close to me. "I'm here." For a few minutes, I believed him completely. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. "I need to take this downstairs." "Stay. It's the Richmond lender. If I don't answer, the project may collapse." "Peter, I'll be back before they decide anything." He kissed my forehead and left. He did not return before the doctors decided to perform an emergency cesarean. Samuel was born at 6:42 that evening. 4 pounds, 3 ounces. I heard one short cry before the neonatal team carried him away. Then I began hemorrhaging. When I woke in recovery, Colonel Naomi Reeves was sitting beside me. Naomi had commanded me twice during my career, and now directed medical readiness for the installation. After my mother died, I had listed her as my emergency contact. "Samuel? Alive. He's in the NICU. Peter? Coming." Peter arrived nearly 2 hours later. He said his phone battery had died while he was speaking with the lender. He looked pale when he saw me. He sat down, gripped my hand, and cried. His shoulders shook. "I almost lost both of you." He remained beside my bed until a nurse told him to go home and sleep. The next morning, he carried a bottle of expressed milk into the NICU. He had labeled it with the date and time. He washed his hands twice before reaching through the opening in the incubator. Samuel's fingers closed around one of his. Peter bowed his head. For several seconds he could not speak. Then he whispered, "Hey, buddy. We waited a long time for you." I turned away, because watching them together hurt in a good way. That is the memory people misunderstand when they ask how I failed to recognize what Peter was doing. He did not behave like a villain every hour. He brought milk. He learned how to support Samuel's head. He cried when our son wrapped a hand around his finger, and while he was doing those things, He had already filed papers to take Samuel from me. Peter had not designed a flawless conspiracy. He had made one selfish decision, and then needed another lie to protect it. He began an affair. He invested money he could not afford to lose. The Richmond project began failing. Then he learned Samuel's trust might reimburse legitimate expenses connected to the child. Peter did not suddenly become a criminal genius. He saw an opportunity, and kept changing his story whenever someone asked the wrong question. Patricia supplied observations about my behavior. Celeste repeated what he told her to my prospective employer. A company attorney helped him prepare a custody petition. Peter connected those pieces because they were already available. His plan looked sophisticated only from a distance. Up close, it was held together by fear, entitlement, and people who chose not to verify what he told them. During Samuel's 18 days in the NICU, Peter's visits became less frequent. He blamed the Richmond development. One night, he arrived after midnight carrying coffee and a clean sweater for me. He sat beside the incubator for almost an hour. Before leaving, he kissed Samuel through the open panel. "I'll get the house ready," he said. I believed he meant the nursery. Patricia visited more often than he did. The first time she held Samuel, she cried so hard that a nurse brought her a chair. "He looks exactly like Peter did." Then she looked at me. "You did it." There was no criticism in her voice, only wonder. 2 days later, she began asking questions. How much was I sleeping? Did I ever feel confused? Had I experienced frightening thoughts? Was I sure I could manage the baby alone? I thought she was checking on me. I did not know Peter had asked her to record anything he could later describe as concerning. One afternoon, Patricia stood beside Samuel's incubator while he slept. She reached toward the glass, then stopped. "Peter thinks you may need time away after discharge." "Away from what?" "From the pressure. I'm taking him home." Her eyes filled. For 1 second, she looked as though she wanted to tell me something. Then she smoothed the blanket inside the incubator. Of course. She chose her son before she chose the truth. But the choice cost her something. I saw it before I understood it. The night before Samuel's discharge, Peter called. "I've arranged somewhere for you to stay." "I already have somewhere to stay." "We need to talk before you come back." "Then come here." "I can't tonight." "What is going on?" He was quiet long enough that I heard someone moving in the background. Then he said, "Just don't make a scene tomorrow." Naomi drove Samuel and me home the following afternoon. He was secured in the back seat, small enough that the car seat seemed built for another child. I turned around every few minutes to make sure his chest was moving. The townhouse looked ordinary. That was the first cruel thing about it. The same brick steps. The same planter near the driveway. The same curtains visible through the nursery window. My key did not work. I tried again. Then Peter opened the door. Celeste stood behind him wearing black trousers and one of his white shirts. Her suitcase was beside the stairs. My wedding photograph had been removed from the wall. The silver frame that once held Samuel's ultrasound picture now contained a photograph of Peter and Celeste at an Ashford Company dinner. Peter looked toward Naomi. "I didn't realize you were bringing someone. She needed transportation. This is a private family matter. She has a premature infant who left intensive care less than an hour ago." Peter turned back to me. "I told you we needed to talk. You changed the lock. I needed boundaries." Celeste folded her arms. She did not smile. "Peter said you understood the separation. I gave birth 18 days ago. He said the marriage ended months ago. Did he also say I still lived here?" Peter took a folder from the entry table. Inside was a separation agreement and a proposed parenting plan. I would stay in a furnished apartment. Peter would remain in the house. Samuel would gradually transition into his care after a pediatrician approved overnight separation from me. I read the first page twice. "You want me to leave him here?" "Not tonight," Peter said. "No one is saying tonight." Patricia stepped out of the kitchen. She had been there the entire time. "Leah, you need rest. You packed my clothes." Her eyes moved toward Samuel. For a moment, her face collapsed. She stepped forward and touched the edge of his blanket. "He's so small." "Then tell your son to let us inside." Patricia looked at Peter. Peter did not move. She could have ended it there. She could have handed me the spare key. Instead, she said, "Maybe one quiet night somewhere else would be best." Samuel stirred. Patricia pulled her hand away. Naomi took the papers from me. "Has Leah's attorney reviewed these?" Peter reached for the folder. "It is only a proposal. then she is not signing it at the door. This has nothing to do with you. It became my concern when you locked one of my officers and her infant out of their home. I could have forced my way inside. My name was on the deed. But Samuel had been discharged with instructions to avoid stress, crowds, and unnecessary disruption. I would not turn his first night outside the hospital into a struggle in a doorway. Naomi took us to temporary family lodging near the medical center. The room contained a bed, a kitchenette, and a heater that clicked every few minutes. I tried ordering formula and diapers. The joint credit card was declined. Our checking account contained $2,116. 2 weeks earlier, it had held more than $19,000. I called Peter. "Have your attorney contact mine." Nothing about Samuel's monitor. Nothing about his feeding schedule. Nothing asking whether we had arrived safely. At 3 a.m, I stood beneath the bathroom light and studied my own face. My skin looked gray. My incision hurt. My hands shook from lack of sleep. For several minutes, I wondered whether Peter's story might work, because I looked exactly like the woman he had described. Exhausted, frightened, barely holding things together. Then Samuel began crying. I fed him, changed him, and settled him against my chest. By sunrise, I had stopped asking how to make Peter believe me. I needed to know what he had already done. Naomi referred me to Daniel Ruiz, a former military attorney who now practiced family law. He listened, reviewed the parenting proposal, and asked who controlled my mother's trust. Julia Bennett, the estate attorney. Can Peter withdraw money? No. Can a custodial parent request expenses? For approved needs. Daniel pointed to one paragraph in the proposed plan. Peter wanted authority to manage Samuel's housing, medical, and childcare requests. Then Daniel obtained the custody petition. Peter had filed it 21 days before Samuel was born. Before the hemorrhage. Before the NICU. Before anyone could claim that my postpartum condition had caused his concern. That was the first major crack in his story. The second came from the account Peter had used. When the bank representative read the full name connected to WDC Patient Services, I thought I had misunderstood her. Ward Development Consulting, Celeste Ward's private company. The payments totaled $86,300. Most of the money came from my inheritance, deployment bonuses, and a medical settlement after my third miscarriage. Peter had described it as his personal investment in the Richmond development. The company had received my money. What Celeste knew was still unclear. I wanted her to be the person behind everything. It would have made the betrayal easier to understand. But the records showed Peter had access to the account and had presented himself as the investor. The money was the first major discovery. It was not the one that mattered most. The second major discovery came from Julia. Before Samuel was born, Peter had asked whether trust funds could reimburse home modifications. Julia told him medical necessity would be required. Peter sent her a preliminary budget anyway. It was a modified version of an existing Richmond project template. He had replaced ordinary room descriptions with terms such as therapy space and medical access. One heading still contained Celeste's company name. The document was not polished enough to prove a carefully designed scheme. It looked more like Peter had been searching for a way to save a failing investment and realized Samuel's future expenses might be useful. That made it more believable. It also connected the missing money to the custody petition. But we still had a problem. Financial misconduct did not automatically make me the safer parent. Peter could claim the investment was separate from his concerns about my mental health. We needed to show that the story about my military career was false. The answer was already in an old text conversation. Months earlier, I had written, Naomi approved the education assignment. No deployment for at least 2 years. We can finally stay in one place, Peter replied. That will make things easier with the baby. His custody petition later claimed I intended to return to operational duty within weeks. He had not misunderstood my plans. He had changed them. Those 3 discoveries were enough. The custody filing before Samuel's birth. The money from my account. The false claim that I was leaving. Everything that came later happened because Peter could no longer keep those facts separate. At first, Celeste refused to speak with us. Her attorney stated that she believed the money was Peter's separate investment, and that my marriage had nothing to do with Ashford. Then Ashford discovered that the proposed trust budget had been created from one of its project files. The company opened an internal review. The Richmond lender asked Peter to verify the source of his investment. Celeste's authority over the project was temporarily frozen. She still did not cooperate with me. For several days, She tried to protect her position without admitting Peter had lied. She gave Ashford selected messages, in which Peter described the money as his savings. She told investigators that her call to my prospective employer had been a private mistake. She insisted the custody dispute had nothing to do with the company. Then Peter began distancing himself from her. He told one investigator that Celeste had handled the investment paperwork. He suggested she had misunderstood his marital status. He stopped answering her calls. Celeste arrived at the Ashford office one morning and discovered her access card no longer opened the executive floor. Peter walked through the lobby while she was speaking to security. According to Celeste, he looked directly at her and continued walking. That was not enough to change her mind. Not yet. She still believed she could preserve her career by limiting what she admitted. She came to Daniel's office with her attorney a week later. She did not come to confess. She came to find out how much we knew. Peter told me the marriage had been over for almost a year, she said. We shared a bed until the week I was hospitalized. He said it was for appearances. What appearances? His mother. Your command. The pregnancy. Daniel showed her the bank records. Did you know the investment came from an account used for fertility treatment? No. Did you verify the source? He was an authorized account holder. Celeste looked at the original deposits. My inheritance. My military bonuses. The medical settlement. He told me this was money he saved before the marriage. It wasn't, I said. That does not mean I knew. She was right. The records proved Peter had lied. They did not prove Celeste knew the source. Daniel showed her the document Peter had described as evidence I would leave Virginia. It looked like military paperwork. Naomi had identified it as an old readiness exercise schedule, with the heading removed. Peter had not created a complicated forgery. He had cropped a real document and let Celeste reach the conclusion he wanted. Did he tell you Leah would be reassigned? Daniel asked. Yes. Did you know the document was old? No. Celeste's attorney requested a break. When they returned, Celeste admitted Peter had discussed becoming Samuel's primary parent. She admitted he told her the child's medical and housing costs would be covered. She denied knowing the details of the trust. Then she refused to answer more questions. She left without offering her private messages or agreeing to testify. I thought the meeting had failed. 3 days later, Peter submitted a written statement to Ashford. He claimed Celeste had encouraged the investment and handled the relationship with my prospective employer on her own. His statement placed the responsibility for the company problems on her. Celeste received a copy through her attorney. That was the moment her position changed. Not because she suddenly cared about me, not because she regretted the affair enough to become noble. Peter had made it clear that if someone had to carry the consequences, he had chosen her. Even then, she did not immediately give us everything. First, she authorized Ashford to preserve her full work account. Then she provided messages showing Peter had described his investment as personal savings. Only after investigators recovered exchanges she had deleted did she agree to testify. Her decision happened in steps: denial, self-protection, anger. Then the realization that continuing to protect Peter would only help him blame her. When her attorney called Daniel, he said Celeste was willing to confirm 3 things. Peter lied about the status of our marriage. Peter misrepresented the source of the investment. Peter gave her a false picture of my military plans. That was all she promised. I thought we needed more. Daniel did not answer. He had received one additional message through the company's document production. He read it alone. Then he placed it in a sealed folder for the hearing. What does it say? I asked. Something Peter should explain before we do. That was the document he had kept hidden at the beginning of the hearing. By the time the custody proceedings resumed, the case came down to 4 questions. When had Peter begun preparing to take Samuel? Did he know I was staying in Virginia? Had he behaved like the more involved parent? And what was he trying to gain? Peter's attorney began with my miscarriages. He described the treatment I received after the second loss. He showed the photographs of the labeled nursery and medical charts. He said Peter had watched grief gradually change me. Daniel allowed him to finish. Then he asked Peter about dates. You filed for custody before Samuel was born? Yes. Before the emergency delivery? Yes. So the surgery did not cause your concern. It confirmed it. How could an event confirm a petition you filed before it occurred? Peter looked toward his attorney. Daniel did not continue that line. He showed Peter the text message about my assignment. Did you know Leah had 6 months of approved leave and a non-deployable position? I knew she was discussing options. You replied that staying in one place would make things easier with the baby. Peter read the message silently. The judge wrote something. Daniel moved to Samuel's care. How many specialist appointments did you attend after 28 weeks? I don't remember. The records show 1. I was working. How many nights did you remain at the NICU? I visited frequently. That was not the question. None overnight. What medication did Samuel receive after discharge? I would need to review the instructions. Peter's signature did not appear on the discharge training forms. Mine appeared 6 times. Daniel sat down. He did not spend another hour proving Peter had been absent. The point was already clear. Naomi testified briefly. She confirmed my assignment and described the day she drove us home. The changed lock, Celeste's suitcase, the separation papers. She offered no opinion about Peter. She said what she had seen and stopped. Then Patricia was called. Daniel showed her the notebook. Did Peter ask you to document Leah's behavior? He asked me to note anything concerning. What concerned you? She checked the monitor repeatedly. Had Samuel experienced an apnea episode? Yes. She required visitors to wash their hands. Yes. Was that medically recommended? Yes. She limited visitors? Yes. Was that also recommended? Yes. Daniel paused. Did you ever see Leah threaten Samuel? No. Did a doctor tell you she was unsafe? No. Did Leah tell you she intended to leave the child? No. Then why did you help another woman move into her home? Patricia looked toward Peter. He said Leah knew. Did you ask her? No. Why? Her eyes filled. Because I was afraid of what would happen if Peter lost everything. What did you think he would lose? His marriage, his job, his chance to be a father. Daniel's voice remained level. So you helped remove Samuel's mother to protect Peter's chance to be a father? Patricia gripped the witness rail. Yes. The answer seemed to surprise even her. She admitted packing my clothes. She admitted giving Celeste the key. She admitted writing down my behavior without asking a doctor whether any of it was abnormal. Daniel showed her a short message Peter had sent during my pregnancy. It did not say that my miscarriages would make the case easy. Peter had been more careful than that. The message read, "Keep notes. Her history matters, especially if she starts overreacting after the birth." Did you understand what he meant by her history? Daniel asked. Patricia looked at me. The miscarriages. Did you warn Leah that Peter was collecting information? No. Patricia began crying. I did not look away. She loved Samuel. That did not prevent her from helping Peter. Her tears made the betrayal sadder. They did not make it smaller. Julia's testimony lasted less than 10 minutes. She confirmed Peter had asked about trust reimbursement before Samuel was born. She explained that he submitted a budget based on the Richmond property, even though no doctor had recommended those changes. Peter's attorney argued that financial questions belonged elsewhere. Daniel agreed that the family court was not deciding whether a crime had occurred. The records were relevant because they helped explain why Peter wanted control of Samuel's expenses. The judge allowed the limited testimony. Then Celeste entered. Peter had known she might be called. He did not know what she had agreed to admit. She acknowledged the affair. She acknowledged moving into my home. She acknowledged calling my prospective employer. She said Peter had told her our marriage was over and that I would return to military duty. Daniel showed her the cropped schedule. She confirmed Peter had presented it as a current assignment document. Naomi had already established that it was not. Daniel showed her the account and the investment agreement. Celeste confirmed Peter described the money as his savings. Did you know the account had been used for fertility treatment? Daniel asked. No. Did you ask? No. Why not? Because believing him was easier. It was the most honest answer she gave. Daniel asked whether Peter had discussed becoming Samuel's primary parent. Yes. What did he say? That it would make the living arrangement simpler. Did he mention the trust? He said once custody was settled, there would be one point of contact for expenses. That wording sounded like Peter. Careful, administrative. Nothing as direct as admitting he wanted control of the money. Daniel displayed the message. Once the residential arrangement is clear, Julia won't have to deal with competing requests. That should make approvals easier. On its own, the message proved little. Combined with the custody petition and the Richmond budget, it meant more. Celeste admitted that she did not ask why Peter was discussing trust approvals before Samuel was born. She admitted she called my prospective employer without verifying that I was under psychiatric evaluation. She did not become a hero. She became a person forced to acknowledge that she had accepted every lie that benefited her. Daniel thanked her. Then he returned to our table. Peter's attorney looked relieved. The worst appeared to be over. Peter had survived the affair testimony. He had explanations for the money. He could call the trust budget preliminary planning. He could say Patricia misunderstood his request. Then Daniel removed the sealed folder. He asked Peter to return to the witness stand. Peter's attorney objected. The judge allowed a limited follow-up based on newly authenticated company records. Daniel handed Peter one printed message. "Do you recognize this exchange?" Peter read it. His face did not change immediately. "Yes. It was sent on the morning your wife underwent emergency surgery? I would need to check the time. The timestamp is 11:17 a.m. Celeste asked whether you were returning to the hospital." Peter said nothing. Daniel continued. "What did you answer?" Peter's attorney asked to review the message. The judge waited while he read it. The attorney stopped writing. Daniel asked Peter again. "What did you answer?" Peter looked toward the judge. "I was under pressure. That was not the question." Daniel read the message aloud. "If I rush back every time she panics, it only reinforces the problem. I need people to see who stays functional when things go wrong." No one spoke. The wording was not a confession. Peter had not written that he planned to frame me. He had written something colder. He had treated my medical emergency as a test he hoped I would fail. Daniel asked, "What did you mean by people?" Peter shifted. "My family, the medical staff." "The court?" "I was considering every possibility. Your wife was being evaluated for emergency delivery. I did not know how serious it was. You had been told the baby's heart rate was dropping. I also had a business problem." Daniel placed the message beside the custody filing. "You filed for custody 3 weeks earlier. You asked your mother to document Leah's behavior. Then, during a medical emergency, you deliberately stayed away because you believed her reaction might support your case." Peter's voice sharpened. "She always had the military. She always had people rushing in to help her." That was closer to the truth than anything he had said all day. Peter had resented every structure that supported me because he could not control it. The military, the hospital, my mother's trustee, Naomi, anyone who made it harder for him to define me without challenge. Daniel asked one final question. "You requested projected trust reimbursement for the Richmond property before Samuel was born. What medical recommendation supported that request?" Peter looked toward his attorney. His attorney lowered his pen. Peter did not answer. "The judge granted me temporary primary physical custody." Peter received supervised visits twice a week. The arrangement would be reviewed only after he completed a parenting course, provided full financial disclosure, and participated in a custody evaluation. Samuel's trust remained independently controlled. Neither parent could request reimbursement without notice and approval. The judge granted me temporary use of the townhouse and referred the altered document and financial records for separate review. She did not call Peter a criminal. She did not promise that anyone would be arrested. She issued the orders supported by the evidence in front of her. Outside the courtroom, Peter approached me. A court officer remained nearby. "I never meant for it to become this. You filed before Samuel was born. I was afraid. Of losing your son?" Peter looked away. "Of not mattering anymore." There it was. Not an explanation. A confession of entitlement. He had not tried to remove me because he believed Samuel was unsafe. He had tried to remove me because he believed love was limited, and our child would receive the part Peter considered his. Patricia asked to speak with me. "I did not know about the money." "I believe you." Relief crossed her face. Then I added, "You knew he was collecting information about me." Her relief disappeared. "I thought he was scared." "You helped him make me homeless." She nodded. "I did." She did not ask me to forgive her. That was the first honest thing she had done in months. The divorce took another 9 months. The townhouse was sold. Some of the missing money was recovered through the property settlement. Peter was placed on administrative leave while Ashford reviewed the Richmond project. Celeste resigned after investigators concluded that she had violated conflict of interest policies and made unsupported statements to my prospective employer. Her testimony did not erase what she had done. Peter eventually received unsupervised daytime visits after completing counseling and learning Samuel's medical routine. I did not oppose that. Protecting my son did not require me to pretend his father no longer existed. It required me to stop allowing Peter to use Samuel as a financial plan or a weapon against me. Samuel turned one on a rainy Thursday in March. We celebrated in the smaller house I bought after the divorce. 2 bedrooms, 1 floor, a narrow kitchen with a window above the sink. There was no therapy suite, no oversized nursery, no development brochure promising luxury family living. Samuel needed none of those things. He needed predictable meals, follow-up appointments, and adults who understood that a child was not a prize awarded to the person who controlled the better story. Naomi brought him a wooden helicopter. Daniel sent a card with no legal advice inside. My father lay on the living room rug while Samuel tried to climb over him. It was not the family celebration I had imagined during pregnancy. It was quieter. It was also real. I completed my final year of active service in the education position Naomi had helped arrange. After retirement, I accepted a job training hospital emergency planning teams. The work kept me close to home. Peter continued seeing Samuel according to the court schedule. At first, I examined every visit for signs that he had changed. Was he early? Did he remember the medication? Had he secured the car seat correctly? Eventually, I stopped turning individual responsible choices into evidence of redemption. One appropriate decision was one appropriate decision. Nothing more, nothing less. Patricia wrote me a letter several months after the divorce. She did not describe herself as confused or manipulated. She listed what she had done. She recorded my behavior. She packed my clothes. She gave Celeste the key. She repeated claims she had never verified. She watched me leave with Samuel and chose not to stop her son. At the end, she wrote, "I loved my grandson, but I protected Peter from consequences more than I protected Samuel from chaos." I allowed her one supervised visit, then another. I did not restore the relationship we once had. That relationship had depended on me overlooking too much. Any new relationship would have to depend on truth. On the anniversary of Samuel's discharge, I took him back to the military hospital. One of the NICU nurses recognized us near the elevators. Samuel was walking by then, although he moved as if the floor had personally offended him. The nurse knelt in front of him. "You were much smaller the last time I saw you." Samuel reached for her identification badge. She laughed and looked up at me. "How are you doing?" People had asked me that question all year. Most expected a simple answer. Better, strong, healed. The truth was less dramatic. I slept more. I still checked Samuel's breathing at night. Unknown phone numbers no longer made my stomach tighten. I could remember Peter crying beside the incubator without using that memory to excuse what he did afterward. "I'm doing all right." That answer finally felt honest. I had spent months trying to decide which version of Peter had been real. The man who brought milk into the NICU. Or the man who filed for custody before our son was born. The husband who cried when Samuel held his finger. Or the man who chose to remain away during an emergency because he wanted to see whether I would fail. Eventually, I understood that both versions were real. Peter had not become dangerous because every tender moment was false. He became dangerous because he believed those tender moments entitled him to control what happened next. I no longer needed to prove that he had never loved us. I only needed to accept that, when he was forced to choose between loving us and controlling us, he chose control. That evening, I placed Samuel in his crib. The wooden helicopter rested near the wall. Samuel touched my cheek before turning toward the mattress. For 6 years, I had imagined bringing a baby home. In every version, Peter stood beside me. I once believed his presence was what made the picture complete. Now I knew better. A home is not complete because a husband is inside it. It is complete when no one living there has to disappear. I had waited 6 years to bring my son home. In the end, home was simply the place where both of us were allowed to stay.